Great Family here from Blues Guitar Unleashed. Welcome. Thanks for joining me. In today's video, we're going to talk about gear, pedals, one of my absolute favorite things in the whole world. Admittedly, I don't think I do enough sessions with y'all on gear and pedals and how I approach the sound. Now, this is kind of one of those, how do you get the sound of this? I get a lot of those questions. How do I sound like Stevie Ray Vaughan? How do I sound like B.B. King? How do I sound like Albert King? It's a tough question to answer because the reality is that the gear that say Stevie Ray Vaughan used or that John Mayer uses or that, B.B. King played, that gear might not have the same effect for you. And this is something that I've learned, really over the years just of chasing, different sounds. I want to sound more like Gary Moore. Okay, so I'll buy a Les Paul and I'll buy a Marshall. Well, it sort of didn't help. I still didn't sound really like Gary Moore. It was one of those things. I got a Dumble style pedal to try to sound like Robin Ford, and I still don't sound like Robin Ford. And in reality, what I've come to discover is that a lot of times if I want to sound like somebody else, I'm probably, if I want that style of tone, and I don't want to get into the debate about, oh, you shouldn't try to sound like anybody else. I'm just saying if you want to try to get a tone that's sort of in that ballpark, there are usually a multitude of different ways to get there. And I think if you have a good understanding of, particularly pedals, that's usually how most of us are going about getting this. Yeah, it's great if you can buy, a big 100-watt Marshall stack and crank it up. It's going to sound amazing, I guarantee it. But it's going to be pretty impractical for most people. So what I want to show you is kind of a straightforward way that I approach my pedals to get me the type of gain or the type of overdrive sound, because most blues players do have a certain amount of overdrive on their tone. So I'm going to show you how I approach it, and hopefully it will be useful to you. So let me show you my pedal board. For today, what I have is a pretty simple but common setup for me. And here's why. I, generally speaking, sort of divide pedals into three categories. Now, of course, if you've ever seen any of my previous videos on the subject, I used to say all the time that pedals are basically either rats or tube screamers. And what I meant at that time was that most pedals on the market were either some variation of a tube screamer or they were some variation of a rat style distortion, overdrive, whatever you want to call it. That was 10 or 15 years ago. A lot has changed in the pedal world, okay? So nowadays, there's a few more different styles. And so what I've got here, this is a really cool, the reason that this pedal is in this basic gray box is because it was built for me at my request. I have this rat right here that I'm just going to put right there so that you know that this side is a rat pedal and this side is a tube screamer. And I had this made, the person who, you'll notice there's a toggle switch on the rat. Maybe you didn't see it, it's fine. My rats are modified by Modest Mike. If you've never heard of him, just look up, Modest Mike mods. He does a really great rat mod. At least I really love it. It kind of smooths out some of the harsh top end that you can sometimes get from a rat. You can still use a perfectly, stock rat to do what we're gonna do. Your knobs are just gonna be in different places. That's really all it boils down to. You'll also notice that I have this blues driver over here. And this is a pedal that has been associated with me for many years. I have used this blues driver. This particular one is modified by Robert Keeley back from the late 1990s when he used to still do mods on blues drivers. I'm pretty sure he doesn't do that anymore. Nonetheless, nowadays, again, a stock, Boss blues driver will do the job. The knobs will just be in slightly different places and it will sound slightly different, but that's not to say that it's going to be bad. It's just going to be slightly different. If you prefer the sound of mine, the current Wazacraft version of the blues driver gets really, really close to the Keeley sound. I think Analog Man still does a blues driver mod. I know there's a lot of people that still modify blues drivers. So I don't want you to get too hung up on the fact that oh, mine's modded, it must sound radically different. I just don't happen to have a stock one to show you. I don't have a stock one here. but I can assure you it's really not that much different, and for many people's ear, functionally equivalent. So here's what I mean about different, types of overdrives. There are different families of overdrives. Like I said, we have the tube screamer style, which is very inherent. You hear what we call the mid bump. Okay, the high end and the low end are very much removed and attenuated. So what you hear left is sort of mid-range. So here's my Strat. Now notice that my amp is totally clean right now. Okay, there's no overdrive. Okay, it is it's an Avid 11 rack. It's a model. Okay, it's a model of a vintage Fender Super Reverb style amp. So it's very basic, what you might call blackface Fender tone. It's a very kind of even. It's got a little bit of a mid scoop to it, but I crank the mids, so it's pretty flat and even. And I, generally speaking, tend to just like a pretty basic flat level tone. Why? Because it doesn't do anything crazy to my pedals. It keeps things fairly straightforward and fairly simple. It allows this, I can dial up pretty much any amp flat and level. It doesn't really matter what kind of amp it is. If it doesn't have crazy high end and it doesn't have crazy low end, I can make it work. That's really what it's all about. I don't always know, if I'm playing a festival or if I'm going to a jam session or something where I don't know what the amp is going to be, this works really, really well. So again, notice that's totally flat, right? It's totally clean. There's not one little iota of overdrive there. So if I turn on this tube screamer, okay, you'll notice it's just a little bit louder. That has to do more with the fact that my Strat just doesn't have very high output pickups. I don't have it particularly loud for any reason. But you can kind of hear it's very warm, very mid-range heavy. My gain, notice, is fairly low, okay? These switches, don't worry about, they're mics, mods. I have it set like a pretty normal tube screamer. This guy here is the volume, and you'll notice that it's not particularly high, right? You may have heard that, Stevie Ray Vaughan would crank up the volume and keep the gain pretty low. That's a common thing to do, but I don't want to. And the reason I don't want to is because I want this to work just like it is. It's kind of a John Mayer-y type of tone. And that, even by itself, it's a nice warm, potential lead tone that you could use. It's not particularly bright or dark or anything like that. It's just got that very nice warm mid-range content, and I really like that. That's cool. Here's the thing though, tube screamers in particular and rats. So you'll notice that my rat also okay, now the way the rat works, this one here is the gain. So if I turn it, so notice I don't have it on very much. There's just a little bit of gain. And obviously, the way I have it dialed up, it's almost not that much different than the tube screamer. This guy right here is called the filter. Filter control works different on a rat than a tube screamer. As I turn it to the left, you'll notice it gets brighter. And it does that because it's basically like a high cut. So I tend to like it about here. Now on a non-modded rat, I tend to go farther. But you'll notice on this rat, that's a little bit too dark, okay? One of the things I like about the modification is it allows me to run a little bit more high-end without it getting raspy. Disregard this knob up here. That's a little custom thing they added for me. And right now it's in the, I'll say, traditional rat setting. So you don't have to worry about that. This last one right here is the volume. And again, you'll notice I don't have it all that much different. I have it a little bit louder only because, again, my pickups in my Strat are very low output. Pretty much all the time I'm going to have something on, and my Les Paul is louder. So some of this has to do with switching over to the Les Paul. So notice that's also a really nice tone. And even into a straight, clean amp, you've got a pretty decent tone. Now, most people would tell you that you simply can't do that with a Rat. I wholeheartedly disagree. A Rat is typically associated with like grunge, you know, or punk music or heavy metal, where guys would, you know, crank them up, run them into a big loud Marshall and crank them up even further using the Rat. You don't have to use it that way. It's a very versatile pedal by itself. So I kind of like to point that out, that this is an unusual way of getting to this sound, but it's a way that works for me and might also work for you. Now, what I want you to notice is that both of these pedals do something that's very important, which is they cut low end. You'll notice that both of them, when I turn them on, you might think that they sound a little bit weak in the low end. Notice the Tube Screamer also is weak in the high end. The Rat, not so much. Particularly if that's definitely got more high-end presence than that one. But here's the thing. Most overdrive pedals, or I'll say many overdrive pedals, particularly Rats and Tube Screamers, which again, you know, there are so many variations on the Rat these days. I know that Wampler makes one. Lots of different manufacturers over the years that are escaping me have made, you know, Rat variants over the years. The Tube Screamer probably has more variants than any other pedal on the planet. You know, the Boss Super Overdrive. I know JHS makes one called the Bonsai. In fact, they recently they have one called a Screamer, which is obviously their take on a Tube Screamer. Almost every single pedal manufacturer has their take on a Tube Screamer. There are so many different kinds that it's almost impossible to say this is like the standard one. There really isn't a standard one anymore. There's so many different varieties. So bear that in mind. And all of them, the Tube Screamers and the Rats, in my personal opinion, sound best when running into an amp that has a little bit of overdrive already. Now, of course, back in the day, people would take, you know, a Fender, a Super Reverb, or a Twin Reverb if you could stand the volume, and they would turn it up to the point that it would start to break up. Not a lot of distortion, okay? We're not looking for that Marshall stack on 10 kind of overdrive. We're looking for just a little bit of overdrive. The reason we want that little bit of overdrive is because it creates compression. So what I use for that is this Boss Blues driver. And there are so many different pedals that can serve this purpose. And you may have heard the term amp in a box. That's kind of what I have here. The Blues driver is not generally regarded as an amp in a box, but I think it does a very good job. And the reason is because you'll notice that when I turn it on, the low end is still there, the high end is still there. There's just a little bit of overdrive now. And it's not much. But that little bit of overdrive creates compression. And it allows it to kind of, as I call it, soak up the pedal that comes before it. So generally speaking, I will turn that Blues driver pedal on and I will just leave it on the whole time. I will never turn it off. Okay? And the reason I do that is because it's taking the place of that amp turned up to a point where it's starting to overdrive. And while that sounds really great when you can do it, there are not many places one can play these days where you can turn the amps up loud enough to do it on their own. It's just the reality of the world we live in. There's not many stages that I play on where I get to bring, a 100-watt Marshall and turn it up to the point that it's gonna overdrive on its own, or bring a 40 or 35-watt Fender and turn it up to the point that it's going to bring that magic on its own. Okay, that's a really loud amplifier. If you're practicing at home, you're almost surely not going to be able to turn even a 20-watt amp up to the point that it starts to overdrive on its own. Obviously, some people can, and that's great. For me personally, I would rather just find an amp that keeps it nice and even for me, and I use that blues driver for this purpose. I've used so many other ones, by the way. Vemurum, I don't know how you pronounce that. Vemurum Jan Ray, which is kind of like a super reverb type of sound. Love Pedal makes one called the Super 6, which again is kind of based on the Fender Super 6 or Super Reverb style of circuit. Obviously, I'm a Super Reverb fan. I used to own a 1966 Super Reverb. I'm kind of on the hunt for another one because I love them. So that's my model in my 11 rack is that, and I tend to gravitate more towards that sound. But there are lots of different pedals. You can get Marshall in a box style pedals. I use one by MIFX called the Super Crunch Box or Super Crunch Box version 2. I can't remember. It's the one with 4 knobs on it. I use it all the time in, I'll say, more rock settings because I use this same idea in a rock setting. It's just that I use a little bit more gain on the, I'll say, the amp in a box pedal on this one right here. And then when I boost it with these guys, it gets a little bit more. But right now, you'll see, that's sort of my basic tone. It's not much. But depending on what you're playing, it might be all you need. But in most instances, I'm going to want to do a little bit more than that. So I will add in this guy here, the Rat, and I will get a little bit more juice. And if you've ever heard any of my music, you recognize that. Now, the reason that works is because the Rat, you remember, is cutting low end. Now, into a perfectly clean amp, that's not necessarily what we want. But the thing is that as we add overdrive and as we add compression, the bass can get really flubby, okay? And things start to get messy and muddy. And we don't want messy and muddy. And so we want something that's going to cut some bass. When we're going before another overdrive, we want to cut bass. As we add overdrive, we want to cut bass. If I were actually using a Super Reverb, and let's say I turned it up, to 7, 8, 9, 10, I might have the bass off, all the way off. On my Marshall JTM 45 style amp, this guy right here, as I get that volume up, and it starts to overdrive and it starts to get that way, the bass comes down. You want to bring the bass down more and more and more as the overdrive comes up. Otherwise, it turns to mush. I don't have any way to show you that, but hopefully you can kind of imagine what that might sound like. It's just not fun to play. So we want something that's going to cut some of the bass, right? So right now I have a little bit of bass cut, and I'm going to actually ease that up just a little bit. So if I'm doing that kind of thing, and I have a nice tone. And if I need to, I can roll off the volume on my guitar just a little bit. So here's at 10. But if I roll it down to about 8, it's a little bit mellower. It just takes, if I go down to 7, it's even mellower still. And I'm kind of back to a rhythm setting. And this might be all you need. And then I've got a little more to go. Okay, so what I've done is I've created 3 different sounds effectively. And now you might wonder how you get 3 out of that. Well, I've got totally clean, right? I have nothing. Now, I'm probably never going to use that in a blues setting, but it's there, it's an option. I have my, I'll say standard, bass tone. A little bit of drive. And if I wanted a little bit more, oh, that was the level, sorry. If I want a little bit more, then I have just a little bit more. Then I have sort of my next stage up where I add that rat. And truth be told, I pretty much stay here a lot, and I use my volume knob. If I bring it down to 5, it's pretty much as clean as my volume on 10. Obviously it sounds a little different because this is cutting bass. But I can match it up pretty close. Now, of course, if we're playing, if you get into the blues rock realm and you need even more still, you can add the tube screamer, which, remember, is going to cut the bass even more. That's what I want because I'm adding gain, so I want to cut the bass. Now, you probably can hear that hiss. It's going to get a little noisy. But if you're looking for that really, really, in your face, Gary Moore kind of tone, that might be you might have to go that far. You might have to get 3 stages of gain. This is what I would consider 3 stages of gain. My basic, a little bit more, a little bit more. Notice that my guitar signal starts here and goes that direction. Okay, so I'm starting with the last one. Now, these 2 guys here, the Rat and the Tube Screamer, are also somewhat interchangeable for this purpose. So, right now here's just my blues driver. I could add the Tube Screamer. And then I could add the Rat from there. And that's really just a matter of personal taste. I happen to prefer the Rat along with whatever that bass overdrive is because the Rat retains more of the high end. You'll notice that if I use the Rat, you've got more of that sort of stringy high end as opposed to the Tube Screamer. And it's a subtle difference, but it may make a difference to you. Okay, so that's my system for how I like to approach using my overdrive pedals. Now again, if I'm in a situation where I can actually crank the amp up, I'm not gonna need what I'm using the blues driver for. Okay, so on my pedal board, I have the blues driver or the Super 6 or the Jan Ray or the Crunchbox or whatever I'm using in that position. But if I'm playing into my Marshall Silver Jubilee, which already has a fair amount of gain in it, although I run the input gain at about 3. It's not like I use a lot. So I never set up an amp to do a ton of gain. It's always going to be just a little bit, okay? Around on a Fender, you know, like on a deluxe reverb or a super reverb, in that 5 to 7 on the dial. And it just depends because every amp is different. So you never really know. But again, when I do that, I'm going to be bringing that bass way back. So you have to keep it under control. And even still, when I hit that with the Rat or with the Tube Screamer, I want it to pull more bass out. So we never want to add bass before overdrive. As we increase overdrive, we want to remove some of the bass that's going there. You can even use a graphic EQ pedal for this, okay? You can take your graphic EQ pedal and pull the bass sliders down and push the volume up, and it's going to increase your gain while pulling low end out. That's the simplest way to do it. There's a pedal called the Timmy, which is a very popular, transparent overdrive, which is kind of what you might say that blues driver is. It's fairly transparent, meaning the amount of low and high end that comes out is pretty much the same as what goes in. It doesn't change the sound a whole bunch. That's another very popular pedal, and what I like about it is it's got tunable bass and treble cutoffs. So you can really fine tune just how much of the low end you want to take out. The Tube Screamer works great though. I've been using it for 30 years, so I'm used to it. I'm comfortable with it. There are obviously a lot of options out there. What's most important is that you see the theory, you know, I'll say the system, if you will. I start with a basic small amount of overdrive. If I need more, I add more. Now, if I'm playing my Les Paul, by the way, which has a lot higher output pickups, I will probably never have to add the Tube Screamer. The blues driver and the Rat alone will be plenty, and I probably won't ever use the Tube Screamer. It's when I use my Strat that I get to the point that I need all three because of the fact that they're just a lot lower output. The humbucking pickups tend to be much higher output. So I hope this kind of makes sense, gives you some insight into how I like to put things together. Obviously, everybody's got their own thing, and if you have a fair amount of experience with pedals, you've probably already developed your own particular favorites, your own particular habits. But this might give you something to try that maybe you hadn't thought of before. If you're new to pedals, one of the questions I get asked often is, what should be my first pedal? Oftentimes I say something like the blues driver. I think that's a great place to start. Or again, anything comparable to that. There are a lot of variations. There are so many, there are a lot of companies now that basically make, their version of the blues driver. It's a very popular pedal. It's been around for a very, very long time. So it's a great place to start. But anything I think that does a fairly transparent, meaning it doesn't do a lot of bass roll-off or a lot of high-end roll-off. Now, if you're the type of person that only wants one pedal, then obviously you need a pedal that has a lot more control, right? You're going to have a lot more gain available. You're going to have probably bass, middle, and treble controls. Those pedals are out there, but they're going to, you're going to set them at one point and they're pretty much going to stay there. Okay, most people don't want to set it at a high level of gain and stay there the whole time. There's not a lot of pedals that will give you a lot of gain and allow you to roll off your volume cleanly. They still stay fairly dirty. So something to play with. I'm a big proponent of being able to do it all from a volume knob. Unfortunately, the world doesn't always work that way for us. So that's easier to do on like an old Plexi style amp where you have, power amp clipping going on and all that kind of stuff. It's great. You can kind of do everything from your volume knob on your guitar. It's harder to do that with pedals, but there are some really, really amazing pedals out there. It's a fantastic time to be a guitar player. So I hope this gives you some ideas. As always, if you get something out of this video and you dig it, feel free to share it with friends, and hopefully it'll help them too. I'm Griff Hamlin from Blues Guitar Unleashed. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.